Hello, everyone. Today we have Risa Ikeda. She's going to be presenting Shifting Language Ideologies During Study Abroad. The floor is yours.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you, Chris, for hosting. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I was a little bit worried because it was Monday and it was the first session in the morning. So, as Chris already said, I'm Risa Ikeda. Okay, and I'll be talking about shifting language ideologies during study abroad. I work at Yamaguchi University, which is a national university in a rural part of Japan. I'll be drawing on some examples from a case study I did with my students here who studied abroad in the Philippines. But the main part of my talk, I'm hoping to focus on the theoretical parts, which actually normally I wouldn't do. But since I've been struggling to figure out concepts and how to frame my study, and when I take data from interviews and questionnaires with my students, I struggle to find ways to frame my study appropriately. So the language ideologies was something that came up and resonated with, and I think will be useful when researching, especially short-term study abroad. So I hope to introduce this and take up some examples. And if there's time at the end, maybe we could discuss some other possible applications. So in this session, which I realize is short, I'll try to make the timing appropriate. I hope to cover these things. First, I'd like to give some background about recent trends in study abroad for Japanese students, and then introduce what are language ideologies? What is this as a theoretical framework, and how can it be applied to study abroad research? Then I'd like to tell about just a couple of examples with the study that I've done. And at the end, I hope to point directions for future research, which I actually haven't been able to prepare so much, but perhaps we can discuss together. Okay, so I'd like to start with some statistics about study abroad in Japan. This is taken from JALT, which is the Japan, my notes, Japan Association of Overseas Studies, and they are a non-commercial organization, meaning they're not the government, but kind of more like an NGO, NPO type organization. And they've been taking surveys about study abroad, not just between formal agreement type institutions, that means university exchanges and formal degree program exchanges, degree program study abroad, but also the shorter term kind of language schools or informal study abroad situations, which has increased dramatically recently. And what this chart shows, I took the newest one. This was taken in 2018. They published it in 2019. So as you can see, the United States, Australia, and Canada are still dominant as study abroad destinations, but you can also see places like the Philippines and other Asian or European countries popping up here that are not necessarily the so-called native English-speaking world. And my study actually was in the Philippines, so I like to kind of focus more on different kinds of contexts for study abroad. And when we look at the purpose of study abroad, it also becomes clear that short-term language-focused programs, they've increased quite a lot. And you can see that it accounts for actually more than half, or basically 2/3 of the whole study abroad cases. And here, it doesn't say exactly that it's English, but it's presumably many of the cases of study abroad are for studying English, and they do it in a very short term. If we break it down by destination, this is the same data, but you can see the blue part. This is language study for less than 3 months. So if you compare United States, Australia, Canada, and Philippines, actually the Philippines isn't so far behind when we look at the study abroad for short term and for language study. So they are important these days. Okay. To summarize my the background about the situation of study abroad in Japan, so there is a diversification of English learning and study abroad context. So that means specifically in Asia, but also other countries, but I'm going to focus on Asia and short term, and also the lower level kind of students. And in the past, it was kind of the exceptional who would do degree programs and go to prestigious universities and study abroad. But there are a lot more students who are studying abroad short term, and because it's closer and cheaper, and also it gives them an advantage in entering university, or just on their resume, it looks better if they had studied abroad. And what is study abroad? Well, the definition is if you studied abroad for, say, 2 weeks, it counts toward, oh, I have studied abroad. And so people are taking advantage of these opportunities. And so therefore, I aim to, when I wanted to research this, I wanted to find out what is an appropriate way to research more short-term study abroad experiences. And when people go to, for example, Asian context, or contexts that wouldn't have been mainstream or the native English-speaking sphere. And these studies are not as common yet, and so I've been trying to find ways to research this kind of context. And I've been going kind of back and forth between different concepts and kind of different fields also when researching short-term study abroad. I think based on my own background, going to graduate school in the US and kind of feeling that it's important to listen to stories about people's lives and people's experiences, I tend to veer toward the qualitative kind of sphere. But a lot of the case studies, as I've already mentioned, that take a qualitative approach, they focus on more advanced learners, or say they go longer term, or they're immigrants. It's more an essential part of their lives, this change. And so the studies, for example, focus on social identities. So while I like this approach and I resonate with it, it didn't quite fit my students. When I interviewed my students who had studied abroad for 4 weeks, and they came back, I asked them, did it change you? Did it, change your identity? But when I listened to their stories, it wasn't more, it entirely changed their, themselves. It changed their worldview, but not, 4 weeks doesn't change their entire being so much. So it was more like, oh, actually, well, English was really difficult for me, but I realized it was okay to make mistakes, or it felt easier for me to converse with foreigners when I got back to Japan. It was kind of like a more emotional change, perceptual change. And so then I looked at emotions and the psychological aspect of language learning and study abroad. And I was looking at things like willingness to communicate, motivation, confidence, affect, the emotion, so loosely emotions, which are also very popular these days in terms of studies in language learning. But then when I looked at those, it was very informative looking at those studies, but then I didn't find the more detailed stories, the qualitative kind of narratives and approaches in that kind of research so much. There are mixed method studies, but I didn't find that it fit what I wanted to say. There's something was still kind of missing. So I kept looking, and when I was looking at research in study abroad is a field these days, but it's still kind of a growing field. There aren't as many studies in Asian or kind of diverse contexts as there are in, say, study abroad studies that originate in America or Canada, and they study in kind of exotic countries and they learn different languages. So I've been kind of trying to find something that fits. And when I was looking at beliefs in study abroad, or how people's beliefs toward language learning changed, I came across this concept of language ideologies. But what are language ideologies? And as I looked into it more and more, I found that the term was trickier than even as I started researching. And people would call it ideologies of language, or language ideology in the singular, or linguistic ideology. And they're kind of these different terms, and they had all different definitions, and they came from different fields. So I still don't know how exactly to put it, but my basic understanding, this is my wording at the top here, is that language ideologies are a set of beliefs, maybe not just one belief, but it's kind of a systematic set of beliefs about language associated with particular socio-political contexts and communities. So it's connected to their surroundings. This is an important part of language ideologies. And it might be political, it might be kind of socio-culturally contextualized. Originally, it was taken from linguistic anthropology, I believe, according to what I've read, where it is used to address issues in ethnography, politics, and history. Then this got adapted to also language learning settings and study abroad settings. And in Surtees, this article is something I really agreed with, and so I decided to adopt it. The important part that I found in this article was that language ideologies are socially constructed rather than inherent in an individual. So this is the difference between beliefs and language ideologies, is that if you have a belief, for example, I'm just going to give it one example, kind of off the top of my head, is, so say when I teach TOEIC classes or English in university, I come across students who kind of come to me and say, what's a good way to raise my score on the TOEIC? And I really want to know about a good vocabulary list so I can memorize it and get a high score in the TOEIC. So this student has a belief that if they memorize vocabulary, their English is going to improve. And so if we, as English teachers, maybe we think, oh, this student believes this approach to learning, that memorization and grammar and vocabulary are important for learning, and this belief is actually wrong. We want to teach communication. We need to fix this belief. So we might think that, but actually, it's not actually that student's fault. It's connected more to, it's not only this student who believes that vocabulary is important or grammar is important. This student got this belief because they grew up in an environment where they had to study for entrance exams, where they were taught that vocabulary is important, where they were taught that grammar is important, and not maybe communication wasn't emphasized so much. But as you can see, it's connected to that social context that that student was in. So for me, it's important not just to take that one belief and how is that belief going to change, or how much is that belief popular, but it's important for me to connect, how did that belief come about, and how is it connected to that person's background, and how is that going to connect with when they go study abroad, how is that context going to change those beliefs? So it's kind of a systematic change. And so I found language ideologies useful for drawing connections between learner anecdotes and also my own observations regarding their learning context. I could start to connect those concepts in my research. Okay, so moving on to my examples. I don't want to spend too much time going into the details. I have written an article about this that I published earlier this year. I'm going to put them in the references. I have more details about the study and how I put the data and so on there. But roughly, so I did research on my students. We went to the Philippines together for 4 weeks in 2018 in the summer. It was not for credit. We just go there, so basically to raise their TOEIC score and kind of mentally prepare them for study abroad in the future. They were all first-year students in our university. There were 103 in all. We go all at the same time. And 14 of them agreed to interviews before and after the trip. They were semi-structured interviews. I interviewed them for about an hour or so each before and after. And I'd also like to note that they were not super advanced students. We are very interested in international issues and studying abroad and kind of global thinking, but not everyone has already had that experience of studying abroad extensively. And so they're interested, but still not at that high level. So I would describe them as beginning to intermediate level, perhaps SEPR A2 to B1. And in this context, so of us from Japan going to the Philippines, I tried to analyze in terms of, so what are the ideologies that exist in Japan and what are the ideologies that exist in the Philippines? They're not the only things that come into play, but I figured contextually, these are the important spheres culturally. So I picked up in more detail than I can show here, but I picked up some details about this context. So roughly, I'm going to just kind of give the overview that in the Philippines, English is used for education and work. This is different from Japan, as I'll point out. They have a very intercultural context compared to Japan, in that English is used for communication within the Philippines among people from different areas, because people locally, they speak different languages. And so they need English as their national language and to communicate with each other. So it's used for a more realistic purpose in that context. Because also their English level is high, because they use it so much for education and work and for communication, this created jobs for them, for example, in call centers or language schools. And so that's also why we send them to the Philippines to learn English, because their English level is high. And so they have a lot of English teachers and people who work using English in the Philippines. In contrast, in Japan, English is kind of, I would characterize as it's for status. I might say it's for social capital more than for realistic use. So as you probably know, in Japan, if you have a high English score, it would help you get into university. TOEIC scores might give you a higher position at work. At the same time, it's not used so much really, right? There's more of a psychological barrier when we actually use it and face people and use it for communication. Japanese is taken as granted as the dominant language, including for education and work. And English kind of it's just this false thing that exists as status more than real communication. And English learning within the Japanese educational system is still influenced by exam washback, for example. So the entrance exams play a role in shaping what English is more than its actual use. So these are some of the differences between the Philippines and Japan. It's not so much that originally the Philippines had a lot of English-speaking people, but they adopted the policy of teaching and using English. So it's used more professionally and educationally. And so we end up in Japan sending our students to the Philippines. And so in this context, when I interviewed my students, I'm just going to pull a couple of examples. So again, I had 14. These are just short snippets for 2 of the interviewees that I had. So I got these stories, and I'm going to try to make sense of them more by connecting what they said to the cultural contexts that we were dealing with. So again, we went from Japan to the Philippines, and they came back. But this difference in context created a kind of shift in thinking. And this is how I'm going to frame these interview excerpts. So one of the interesting findings I had from my interviews was, this is Misato, this is a pseudonym, but just a quote, she said, up until high school, we translated English to understand it and answer questions, like we read something, memorized it, and solved problems. But in the Philippines, we had conversations, and it wasn't like we tried to understand every single word that was written down. There was something we wanted to say, and it would be like, oh yeah, I get it, that's what I mean, and I could really use English intuitively as a tool. So now when I read English, I can catch the contents of it and what it's trying to say rather than translating it. And that was, I think, the biggest thing. I think the key point was I could speak naturally with the teacher and have a conversation outside of class. So this was, I think, the most important part of her story when I asked her just loosely, how did you feel you changed, or what did you feel you gained from the trip? This is what she told me. I'll just note that the interviews were in Japanese. This is all my translation. Another student told me, I thought I need to find the opportunities and time myself to choose by myself something like to put it in front of me, I need to make sure to take the opportunities myself, or else my English won't improve. It hit me that I won't become able to use English if I don't. Before I went on the trip to the Philippines, I'd always thought things would sort themselves out. But when I went overseas, I really thought I needed to do something or else it wouldn't happen. If I hadn't been looking up videos to watch or studying by myself, I probably have been along those same lines my entire life. So because of that realization, I started the online course and I started asking questions to my teachers. I might not have done that otherwise. So she too had this kind of shift in thinking. And so what I wanted to point out in both of these was that they had this expectation that they wanted to improve their English, or they just wanted to be exposed to this new cultural context and they could just absorb the English and raise their skill, or just kind of absorb what was going to happen.
Minutes.
But actually, it wasn't as simple as just kind of, okay, I'm going to learn this and this is going to improve. They had to change their entire thinking or their attitude or their beliefs about how they perceive language and how they were going to learn it. And so what I found really most interesting in interviewing my students, and it was a pleasant surprise, was that it wasn't so much they felt actually that their English levels per se improved. They told me more about, oh, I felt easier in speaking English, or I had this change in my thinking about how I should learn. And this, I think, was the takeaway of the trip. Of course, our English skills improved, but I found this qualitative aspect just important for their experience, and I felt it deserved documentation, which kind of gets lost when you do the quantitative studies about correlations and how much their proficiency improved. So I wanted to have this qualitative part.
About 3 or 4 minutes left.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so to summarize, their exposure to a different educational culture and extensive opportunities to interact with Filipino teachers in a friendly manner allowed them, or especially the first learner, to shift her way of thinking about English and language learning. The second learner also had expected to acquire English automatically by joining the study trip. Upon realizing that wasn't going to happen, she had to reconceptualize the way she would take ownership of her learning. And I'm going to argue that it was important to think about why these changes took place, and that's why I did the qualitative part. It was important to know that it was a Filipino context, and that's why the teachers seemed friendly. We could talk with them one-on-one. So I can explain this, but all the classes are very short in number. So it's not a 30-person class, it's mostly one-on-one. At best, it's 5 or 6 to 1. So they had a lot of opportunities to talk and interact. Also, by looking at their background, that they're from Japan, that it's typically the norm to stay quiet, to not take initiative, not to take action. And so that's why Minami had this shock when she went to the Philippines and realized she had to take action. And the goal of me adopting this approach of looking at context is not to essentialize the experiences of particular kinds of learners, saying that, oh, in the Philippines it's like this, or in Japan it's like this, but rather to account for different contexts and the details of this, and to connect this with the details in individual experiences. And in particular, learners and learning contexts outside of the inner circle, that means the native English-speaking countries, haven't been documented so much until now. And although I couldn't do this in my study, further research could include comparisons of data from case studies in different cultural contexts around the world, such as Malta, Brunei, Singapore, Korea, it's kind of endless, versus US, Canada, Australia. How are they different? How are they similar? And that's kind of all. I had some questions for discussion if we had time, but thank you all for joining. I didn't expect so many people. Thank you so much.
I'd like to welcome everybody now to unmute your mics, and let's give Risa Ikeda a big round of applause. We do have about 30 seconds for 1 minute if there's a question or two. If you email me, I could send my slides. I have some of my references here. And seeing that there are no questions, everybody, one more time, big round of applause. Thank you.
Risa, can I just check? Oh,